Well, good morning once again. I've just been given the green light by our AV person. Thanks again, Steve. So we might get this show started. Good morning, my name is James, and on behalf of City Legal, it's my pleasure to welcome you wherever you're dialing in from, or if you're here in person, to our first live event in Canberra since local restrictions are lifted. I hear a bit of applause from the audience here, which is fantastic. Look, it was a little disorientating waking up today and having to travel a little further than my living room, dressed in my favorite hoodie to get here, but I am thrilled to be here in person. Let me just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians upon whose land we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and to pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Now I'm excited to present to you our last session in our Civic Leaders series that we've been running throughout this year, where we've drawn upon the lives of biblical persons displaying leadership in times of uncommon stress and pressure. Today's talk is brought to us by David Robertson and is titled Nehemiah, the Administrator. David will no doubt be a familiar figure if you've been following this series, but as a brief recap, David is a Scottish transplant who relocated to Australia in 2019 to head up the Third Space, an initiative which aims to provide a safe space for people to explore spiritual issues, and in particular, the person of Jesus as presented in the Bible. Now, David does this in conjunction with working with a number of local churches. Dave, I might actually get you up if we can break the ice on this presentation to ask a quick question so people get to know you better. Now, on the last couple of occasions where I might get you, if that's kind of in the middle of your eye, no? Okay. And on the past couple of occasions where you spoke, you've taken exception to what the Australians have labelled Scotch whisky, in inverted commas, for your benefit. I wanted to ask whether or not that situation has since improved, or you simply resign yourself to returning back home before you can fix yourself a proper drink.
Well, is this on, by the way? This thing's working, yeah. I feel like a traitor because my favorite whiskey is now Japanese whiskey. And so I feel so guilty. It's, you know, I feel like, you know, an Ulster Protestant saying his favorite Christian is the Pope or something, you know, I just, and I had a Tasmanian whiskey that was fantastic, but it was, for a Scotsman, exorbitantly expensive. So if the Tasmanian guys cool down the prices, they could take on the Japanese. But Mr. Powell sitting here, I introduced him to the joys of Lafroig last night, and so I'm back convinced that we're still number one. But the Japanese, they certainly know how to make whiskey.
I mean, thank you for that. If we're going to talk about cost, we probably need to build in the cost of the airfare back to Scotland as well. So,
well, you know, they do ship it. You know, they've got it. Even I was in a very small Highland village called Brora, which had a distillery called that produced Clynelish. And in this hotel, I think the last time we were here, they actually had Clynelish, which is the first time I've come across it in Australia. I also want to say this: there were a group of lawyers who I went through a number of tragedies, including the death of my father, and some of the lawyers here online contributed to buying me 3 bottles of whiskey. And what was remarkable was that it was very thoughtful, because they took 3 bottles of whiskey from places I'd lived in, and one was the absolute blasphemy. It was English whiskey, because and I have to say it was the worst of the lot. So there you go. But there was also an Invergordon where my dad worked in the distillery. And the Glenmorangie, where I used to live beside Glenmorangie. And the Glenmorangie, by the way, was outstanding. It was the best, probably the best whiskey I've ever had. It was a special Glenmorangie. So thanks to the guy. I've never said thank. Well, I think I may have said thank you in public, but you know, thanks again and again.
Well, look, that's wonderful. Now, today you've wanted me to set the scene for your talk by reading a quick excerpt from Nehemiah. Yeah. So I might do that now, and then I'll get you up in a bit to continue on the talk. So the reading for today is from Nehemiah, specifically chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. You can follow along in your paper program. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought to him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take? And when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy? And because of the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. So that's a reading. David is going to be taking, as usual, questions after his talk, so please keep that in the back of your mind. You can either ask them directly from the audience, or you can submit them either by writing them on the paper programs provided, sending them through to the provided phone number, or submitting them up to the Slido application, for which a link will be dropped in the chat section. And with that out of the way, over to you, David.
Peter Wrench has already told me of a cracking question that is to come, and I feel that I'm going to do what most politicians do. I'll keep talking until there's no time for questions, so I can avoid it. I mean, it is a joy to be here in Canberra again. I'm going to share with you a conviction that you may or may not I agree with. My observation is that in Australia, in Scotland, in the UK, in America, certainly as well, there is a crisis that I would say is a crisis of leadership. And I would say that is in politics, and I would say it's also in the church. I don't know enough to say about business, but a significant number of problems I know within churches are in terms of leadership. And I think in politics as well. I'm thinking of politicians that I've known who greatly admired, who showed great leadership. So David Owen, who was the Labour Foreign Secretary in the UK. There's a politician here, I've just been so impressed with John Anderson. And it seems to me rather bizarre that there's no place in Australian politics for somebody like him. I'm not talking about, left or right. I'm talking about people who show qualities of leadership and are prepared to make hard choices. And in democracies, that's actually quite difficult, because the way that media is just now, you make some hard choices, you could be out. So again, and I think in the church as well, I do think there's this crisis of leadership. Now, having said that, that's why I'm coming to Nehemiah and talking about the civil servant. There was an article, I can't remember, it may have been in The Guardian, talking about how the people who have the real power in the UK and in Australia, in Western democracy generally, are the bureaucrats. So let's see if I can you take that one? There we go. That's it. Now I go back. There you are, Humphrey. If you have seen Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, utterly brilliant. Margaret Thatcher's favorite program, because it was so true to life. It was a comedy, but it is absolutely brilliant. The explanation of why Britain went into the EU, for example, it's just hilarious. But one of the things that it shows is this man, Sir Humphrey, is the one who's always there. The bureaucrats are always there. It's like you go to a church and you're a pastor, and in a Presbyterian setup, the elders, or is it in the Anglican, is it the wardens? I don't quite understand how it works. It's a mysterious thing like the Masons, but the elder will say to you, "I'll be buried here," and you sort of think the sooner the better. But I've been here, and you're going to go. The civil servants, we're here forever. We have the power. You'll do well to last 4 years. So it's in one sense, it's not the politicians who have power. And Nehemiah is kind of a civil servant, as we shall see. Now, I'm wanting just to take some of the aspects of leadership. Now, the book of Nehemiah was written about 2,500 years ago, around 425 BC. The name Nehemiah is a cool name. It means God has comforted. And he was a slave, basically. He was a slave for the Persian king. One of the interesting things about slavery, by the way, which is being reintroduced into contemporary society, is that a lot of people were slaves. Bureaucrats were often slaves. He ends up as the governor or administrator of Jerusalem for about 14 years. The interesting thing for me, anyway, as a historian, is the repair of the wall of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, is the last recorded history in the Old Testament that we have. He also had an interesting job because he was the cupbearer for the king before he went off to Jerusalem. And that might sound kind of grand, but it meant that he had to drink everything first to make sure it wasn't poisoned. So I'm not sure I'd want that job, because poisoning was a very effective way of getting rid of politicians. You couldn't vote them out, so you killed them, you beheaded them, you poisoned them, various things that you could do. And it must be strange, isn't it? You go down to like last night, some of us were downstairs and at the cafe or at the bar or whatever, and say, well, I think whiskey can't be poisoned because it just kills everything. But you get given something, say, well, can you taste this for me first, just to make sure it's not poisoned? And that's your job. Your job is to take a bullet, almost literally. So how did he gets to this position? And I just want to talk about some of the principles that I think are involved in leadership in general, but particularly for those who are involved in public service, or indeed even in church service. One is pathos. The king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. Now, this is his first time he appeared before the king. And you would think he would put on a brave face. The king has the power. He literally has the power of life and death. But Nehemiah had heard what the state was like. And he was just depressed about what was happening to Jerusalem. I think there's a view that we should be quite stoical about things. I don't know. I quite like a politician or a leader that does actually feel things. Now, not the crocodile tears. Tony Blair used to do that "I'm so sincere" thing, which if you have to say you're sincere, then there's a problem. And not I've seen preachers stand up and put on the tears and then just come out and have a laugh. You think, oh, come on, this is just so fake. But you have to feel it. You have to have a burden for the people, and you're meant to be a servant of the people. And I think you do have to really care about what's going on, and not just your own career. And you have to care about your country, and you have to care about the situation you find yourself in. I used to say to church pastors that if you don't love the people of the place that you're serving, and just leave, just resign. You can't do it. It's an impossible job. And that's not to say that you always like or everything, but there's a pathos is how I would describe it. Second principle is prayer. Now, this gentleman here is a man called Alistair Campbell. And at one time, he was the press secretary, if you like, or the PA guy for Tony Blair. And he really did invent spin. Now, spin has always been around, but he took it to a different degree. Ironically, now he's complaining about spin when he's not in power, but the child has grown up and has killed the father, kind of thing. And he intervened all the time. So one time, Tony Blair was asked about George Bush when they're thinking about Iraq. Do you and George pray together? This was, of course, a cynical thing. Did God tell you to go to war and all that kind of stuff? And before Blair could answer, Campbell came in and said, we don't do God. Just that's it. We don't do God. And I find it interesting here in Australia that for some people, you're not as bad as we are in the UK, but to admit that you have a faith that's actually active and that you pray some people see that as a death sentence. that it's so freakish and so unusual. Whatever your personal views of Scott Morrison, I find one of the criticisms of him completely bizarre, and yet it's the one that I hear most frequently made. Well, he's a Pentecostal. That means, amongst other things, people who know nothing start saying, well, it means he's expecting the end of the world, so he's basically speeding things up by increasing coal mining, or getting nuclear war with China, or making all his pals rich, because that's what his religion says, and he prays to God, and God told him to do this. And I'm thinking, you put that stuff in a serious newspaper, if you call the Sydney Morning Herald a serious newspaper now, but people, there's a prejudice involved in that. What is actually wrong with praying? And I think the king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. Now, I don't think that Nehemiah was there, and I don't think he was just standing and said, hang on, king, let me just pray. And then he just, prayed it. It's what people used to call arrow prayers. It's kind of like, Lord, help me here. I don't know what to do. And I myself have sometimes been in situations where I wasn't sure what to say or what to do, and I prayed, and I'm not saying that God gave me immediate revelation, but you pray for wisdom. You pray for grace. And I think actually to be a person of prayer really helps. I'm amazed, the story of, I think it was Eisenhower and Roosevelt, that they went out onto the patio of the White House when you were allowed to do that. And they would just, two of them would smoke cigars when you're allowed to do that. And they would just lie down on the floor and look up at the stars to remind themselves how small they were. One of the things involved in leadership is bizarrely humility and the recognition that there's someone far, far greater than you are. Another one, you see, I like alliteration, is patience. I put the wine glass there because, you need patience to get, I should have put a whiskey bottle really. You need patience to get really good wine. You need even more patience to get a really good whiskey. But Nehemiah 2:1, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought from him, I took the wine, gave it to the king. And then 1:1, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakla, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. Nehemiah, when he heard about what was going on in Jerusalem, didn't immediately go to the king or demand an audience with the king. He waited for his opportunity. It's a little bit like, have you seen Braveheart? Well, of course you've seen Braveheart, the most historically accurate movie in the history of the world. And it's the bit at Bannockburn or whatever, where they've got the spikes for the English horses, and he says, wait, 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 and then just the right time pulls them up. Well, you need patience in leadership. You need patience in politics. You're a new leader and you say, I'm going to go in and I'm going to sweep this clean. I'm going to sort all this out. I'm going to deal with all this. You blow things up and you get blown up. You need patience in how you change a situation. And I think you need to be in it for the long term as well. Revolutions usually end up very badly. This is one area where at least I believe in evolution. And sometimes things can go boom like that. But just to be incredibly patient. Then planning. He goes to the king, or the king asked him, what is it you want? He prayed, I answered the king. And the king with the queen sitting beside him says, how long will your journey take? He said, this is my plan. I want you to send letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that provide me safe conduct. He doesn't say, oh, I'm just going to go and God will protect me. He says, can I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he'll give me timber? He doesn't say, just let me do it. He's thought about, where will I get the wood? Where will I get the timber? How will I rebuild the city? How will I travel? How will it be safe? And he's clearly thought about this for some time. Now, I think that strategy and planning is quite important. I think there's an imbalance at times. I think people make great plans without considering people and without realizing that many are the purposes in a man's heart, or the plans in a man's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails, and that our plans will almost certainly go wrong. You can't work it out exactly. The greatest generals in the world, think of people like Rommel or Napoleon, they were very quick at adapting and changing, but they also did plan. So I do think that planning is important. And I would say that when you say you're a person of prayer, it doesn't mean that you're impractical. Prayer doesn't mean, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to pray. Because that's how often people, so I think the planning is important. Persuasion. He spoke up to the king in verse 3. He spoke to the governors. He spoke to the leaders. In verse 16, actually, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I'd said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials of any others who would be doing the work. He didn't browbeat people. It's far better to persuade people. And to persuade people, you need to get to know them. That's also an important principle. You cannot govern, if you like, or lead from behind a desk, or what we call keyboard warriors. Keyboard leaders are awful. You know, in Scotland, the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats used to be like this as well. They built up a base over many, many years by having good local councillors who went out amongst the people. So my local councillor, I would never vote for the Lib Dems, but I voted for my local councillor who's a Lib Dem. I didn't care because he was a very good local councillor. And you get to know people, and I think sometimes you see that. But you need to be persuasive. Prudence. This is back to verse 16. The officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing, because I said nothing to the Jews or the priests. He just didn't go in with all guns blazing. That may sound the same as patience, but I think prudence it's not cowardice. It's saying, what's the wise thing to do here? Not what's the perfect thing to do, because you don't live in a perfect world, but what's the wise thing to do? And, you know, how can we, at some point, yes, you are going to have to make sacrifices. But, you know, it really isn't prudent for you to jump out of the trench and head towards the machine guns and say, well, look how brave I am. No, you're an idiot. There are sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you have to, you know, you take the risk and what's involved. But I do think prudence is often missed. And powerful. Now I'm using power here in a slightly different way. So in verse 20, there's opposition. Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab heard about it. They mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And he says, look, the God of heaven is going to give us success. Now, this was a level of opposition that in today's Australia, it's a bit like having the media, the academy, the whole legal system, and the political system against you. The whole establishment is in effect against you. And so it's kind of, right, I'm getting out of Dodge. I'm leaving Canberra because I have no acceptance here. But because of all that he was and all that he had done, and also his reliance on God, he just decided, well, that's it. I'm going to, I'm going to do it. And there's a power in that. And I think you see it in, when I'm talking about powerful people, I'm not talking about people who are muscular or people who exude power. I'm talking about people who have the characteristics that are before, but also there's just something, you know, okay, yeah, I'm actually going to go with this guy. Because any leader needs a whole bunch of people who are willing to commit themselves to follow them. Basically, you're not a leader if nobody's following you. I suspect in biblical times, my granddad was a shepherd. My dad, I grew up on a farm. And, you know, how will I put it? In Israel, the shepherd walked in front of the sheep and the sheep followed. They knew his voice. The way that we would do, we would walk behind the sheep or get the sheepdogs to, you know, to chase them and so on. Real leadership is when you lead, people follow, not when you drive them. And I think that's a significant difference. The return of the king. It's very interesting. Nehemiah got almost everything that he looked for. The temple, the walls, the covenant, the people recommitted. It went really, really well for him. It was a tough thing. But there was no king. The king hadn't returned. And this was all set up. The prophet Malachi, the last book in the Bible, was around at this time. And it was all set up for the return of the king, who wouldn't be what these guys expected. And that would be Jesus. And I would say that everything that we're doing at all times is part of a much, much wider thing. The world doesn't depend on us. The church doesn't depend on us. We just get the privilege of being involved. And a real leader is somebody who recognizes that they are genuinely a servant, even if they're the most powerful person in the land. So I'll leave it there. We've got questions and so on.
Thanks again, David. Just a quick reminder, please ask your questions either from the audience or by submitting them by any of the means earlier described. I actually have a question here already, which is a slightly different tack to what you discussed, but I think an important question nonetheless. So the question is, if Jesus is concurrently a man, the Holy Spirit, and God, and knows the number of hairs on our heads, then he would have known that he was going back to heaven, including the exact time and the date he would return. So in other words, where is the ultimate sacrifice of the Christian faith when Jesus knew the exact time when he would return and go to heaven? I might actually read up a follow-up as well. There doesn't seem to be any sacrifice with that. Fear has to do with uncertainty. Fear is what makes it painful. So where is the sacrifice? So the only version of death that is significant, I think this is the question is thought. The only version of death that is significant is uncertainty, I think.
Wow. Right. To whoever asked that question, let me say this. You owe me a beer. That's how I put it, because we need to sit down and talk about this because it's a huge issue. Well, first of all, there are like 10 questions in there. So let me give a very simple answer, and then we'll come back to Nehemiah. Oh, it's not that far from Nehemiah because we're talking about the king. First of all, Jesus is not concurrently man, the Holy Spirit, and God. I realize the doctrine of the Trinity is really very, very difficult, but Jesus is not three. You know, he is not the Spirit, and he is not the Father. He is the Son, and we say all three are God. And if you want to know how all of that works out, I've got a lovely little book by Michael Green on the Trinity. Or if you really want to get into it, just go and read Augustine. It'll take you about 5 years, but then you won't ask questions like that. But I think that's one aspect of it. I think what intrigues me more is the certainty and uncertainty. The whole point, and I think this is really important. If we're talking about leadership, Jesus came down to earth to be human. Part of being human is, the questioner is right, that there is uncertainty. And there were things that Jesus did not know. And one of them is when he would come again. So Matthew 24:36, but about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And that's because Jesus limited himself. So as God, you'd say he could be everywhere, but he wasn't. He was limited in physically. But I would say also he was limited mentally. You don't have Jesus at 5 years old doing, Pythagoras or knowing everything. He learned. So I think that's very important. That's part of the humility of Christ, becoming like us, being tempted like us, suffering like us. And that includes the uncertainty. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus says, if it is possible, take this cup from me. And he's in absolute agony. He's sweating, as it were, great drops of blood. So you're talking here about the humanity of Christ and the divinity of Christ and how they mix together. And it's a huge, huge, huge subject. Just one other thing, because it's I think it's a really, really, really good question. In terms of the sacrifice, I don't accept the premise that if it involves certainty, it's not sacrifice. So I don't know if you've seen the film Gran Torino. This is a plot spoiler, but you should have seen it by now. It's an absolutely brilliant film. And Clint Eastwood in that film, at the end, knows that when he goes to visit the Cambodian gang, he's going to die. He knows that. He's certain he's going to die. The fact that he knew that doesn't mean he didn't sacrifice himself. That's precisely what he did. He sacrificed himself. So I think the fact that Jesus knew he was going to die doesn't mean it's not a sacrifice. In fact, I would say it's even more a sacrifice because he went deliberately.
That's a great answer. We probably have time for 2 more questions, and I have been flagged down, I think, from a gentleman in the audience. I might just pass the mic over to him.
Time is relative, so carry on.
I just wanted to raise, there's one other significant public servant in the Bible besides Nehemiah and Joseph, is Obadiah, who's number 2 to King Ahab in 1 Kings 17, one of the worst kings. And I'm just wondering if you can give any advice for Christians who are in these kind of roles, and it could be public service or medicine or law, where you're involved essentially in things which are ethically very uncomfortable. And what advice you could give to people in those situations? Do you just cut rope and leave, but then you lose your effectiveness? How do you balance the ethics of those kind of roles?
Wow, that's a great question. I'd almost love to go into. It's not just in Romans 16. Paul speaks about Erastus, and this is brilliant. Who's the city's director of public works? Who's a Christian? To Nero. That's just like, that's like serving Hitler. And what do you do? And I think insofar as you can, you're like Daniel, that you follow God. You don't do things that you know that are wrong, but you don't accept responsibility for all that the regime does. There's some Christians who have this bizarrely perfectionist view that, you can't serve in that political party if any of their policies are wrong. Well, sorry, wait. If you had your own one woman, one man political party, your policies would be wrong. So there's nobody gets all of that. But equally, it's not just mild acquiescence will go along with whatever happens. I think each situation, there are lots of biblical examples, you're right. And I think each situation works out in a different way. So I've got a friend just now, in fact, I've got 3 friends who are very involved, who are politicians in the Scottish government. And they know, I'm critical of it, and they know that the direction it's going is at the moment very anti-Christian. But should they get out? People say, you should get out, you should never. No, they shouldn't. They should do what they can. Maybe God will turn it around. And at some point, they will be forced out. But my view generally is until you're kicked out, don't go, but don't compromise what you believe. And, if you're asked something, just say it, and then let them kick you out. Don't play games, don't pretend. So there's a lot in there. It is a great, great, great question. But I do think there's a lot of advice. And that's why I think that's what I was trying to do this series, because it's different contexts demand different responses, but all of them, you must maintain, I would say those principles there, you must maintain integrity. That's very, very important. You're going to lose your integrity, you're done.
We've yet to have any questions come through the... Oh, sorry.
Thanks very much, mate, for your presentation. It was great. I was just really interested in your last point there, powerful, because I've seen so many leaders, I'm sure we all have, who've gone off track because they start to believe they're powerful. And I just wonder whether, what we're looking for is not presence, because as you said in describing powerful, people need to have a reason to follow you. But is it more presence, that it just seems to me as soon as we start to think we're powerful or have that as a factor, that we start to internalize it, and it's no longer Christ who's providing the power, And I've seen so many times that happen.
Yeah, so you're right. And that's why I prefaced my remarks on that particular one with it depends how you define power. So I would say that, in Schindler's List, when Schindler's trying to persuade Goethe, the commandant, to spare the boy, and says to forgive, that is real power. I think power is shown in meekness, actually. I think power is in the Beatitudes. I think power is in somebody comes and threatens you, and you say, well, it's fine. You go to the press, you do what do your worst. So you're right. The caveats you put in there are right, but I would say there is a power you need to have. We talk about the Holy Spirit being powerful and so on. In Northern Ireland, they would say about a preacher, it's powerful, man, powerful. Often that means he just shouted, which I wouldn't describe as power, but powerfulness, you just got this sense of, whoa, there's something here, there's something, And I don't look for strong leaders in the Stalinist sense or the Trump-esque sense or whatever, but I am looking for people who are prepared to make hard decisions and so on. And I say power with meekness may seem a contradiction, but I think it's a biblical one. Anyone else? Are we done?
I think we might be done. Unfortunately, we are kind of hitting up on time too. So we might leave it there. I'm sure you'll leave yourself open, either by way of email or maybe a post conversation.
Yeah, people feel free. One of the frustrating things about these talks is, at one level, is obviously we skim over things and just put principles. But what I'm trying to do is get people to think about how do we do this stuff. And I do think the question, sorry, what was your name? Nick, sorry. I do think Nick's question about how we serve in an increasingly anti-Christian environment, how we do that is one of the key questions for all Christians in most areas of life in Australia today, and cannot be covered in the time that we've had. But I hope I've provoked you to think about it a wee bit more.
Definitely apropos given where we are with a number of government departments surrounding us too. Look, thank you so much for your talk today, David, and for bringing Civic Leaders series to a close. So maybe a quick round of applause for David. We're moving up in the world. Look. Bit of banter from the audience here, which is great. Look, we just wanted to leave a couple of minutes before we drew this session to a formal close for people to fill out a digital form, which you can either access by the QR code on the paper program or through the link, which is dropped in the chat section, if you would like. Now, City Legal will use those details to keep you informed and abreast of future events, but also to invite you to what it calls its hope groups, which are simply groups of people where you can come and explore the biographical accounts of Jesus recorded in the Bible in a social setting. City Legal's hope groups, I have heard, have been a real source of comfort and connection during lockdowns. So they've since been established in places like Adelaide, Melbourne, Canberra, Parramatta, and the Sydney CBD. So chances are that there may be one reasonably close to you. We're eager for the groups to continue to foster meaningful conversations and supportive relationships into the future. And we would love to see you at a hope group soon. So I'll leave you with a couple of minutes to do that. But otherwise, City Legal is already busy planning its events for 2022. So until then, keep safe. And I look forward to seeing you at City Legal's next event. Thank you.